Welcome back to American Lit 1. Today we're talking about Edgar Allan Poe and the fall of the House of Usher. Okay, but enough dramatics. So this is a very dark and very gothic kind of psychological tale. One of my favorites. I've come to appreciate it more and more as I've read it. Uh, because what we have here is a conflict here, a conflict between the narrator, who's a very logical, very scientific-minded human being, and Usher, who is superstitious, frightened, terrified. So let's take it piece by piece here. So we start off when the narrator tells us as he's riding up, he noticed riding up to the house. It's located by what's called a tarn. A tarn is a small mountain lake, and he notices that the house has a large crack in its superstructure. Now, that is symbolic, and we'll talk about it a little bit later on. But we know that our narrator and Roderick Usher were childhood friends, and he's come to comfort him the way that you do, the way that you would for a good friend who's going through some difficult times. Now, the family, of course, they're twins, Roderick and Madeline, and they suffer from a sort of wasting disease, an odd condition that's never really fully fleshed out. We do know that she suffers from catalepsies. The problem being, the catalepsy being a condition where you appear for all practical purposes to be dead, though you're still alive. During the early primitive medical science of the day, and even and for probably a century before, it was hard to know when someone was truly dead. We didn't have the wherewithal to monitor brain waves or heartbeat other than an ear to the chest. Right? We didn't have the means of measuring respiration and the normal bodily functions of a human being. Therefore, if you fell into a deep coma or a catalepsy, as it were, you could be buried prematurely. Even coma patients. Now, you've probably heard the terms graveyard shift and dead ringer. Well, as a means of combating these particular horrors, we have there was a process. Okay, so what happened was, to prevent someone from being buried alive and waking up in the tomb, to the horror of being trapped under 6 feet underground, what they would do is they would run a string down into the coffin. And so if you woke up, you could reach over and pull that string, and on the other end of the string was a bell. And you would ring the bell, and then the person who was sitting up at night, sitting up the day after the burial, all night to make sure that you didn't suddenly revive, was working what was called the graveyard shift. And the person who rang the bell was called a dead ringer. Now you know. So, Usher and his sister Madeline are the last members of their family. They're both twins, and the structure that have come to be known as the House of Usher. Now, there's a double meaning to this here. The House of Usher also represents the lineage of Usher, the house of the house of the Usher family. For you comic book fans, there was a series in the X-Men crossover called the House of M, the House of Magneto, people who bore their allegiance to him. Anyway, there's a crack on the outside of the building, which is a literal crack in the House of Usher. And in the family itself, there is something of a crack. There's damage. There is a danger. Right? This crack is symbolic in that the human house of Usher is cracked as well, of course. Structural damage is reflective of the damage to the family, in this case, madness. Because Usher, as we can tell from the reading, suffers from this pretty serious psychological condition. Depression could be it. Everything is just too much for him. All kinds of scents, food, music that he used to love. His family was musically inclined. Everything is overstimulating to him. So we know that Usher's the last of his family line. There are no heirs left to take on the family name afterward. He's hypersensitive to the point where he can only wear certain fabrics. He can only handle certain sounds, the blandest of music, the most atonal of it. He's plagued by fear, but conversant enough on his condition to realize and to believe that it may actually kill him. The narrator has come to comfort him, of course, in his sorrow because they were childhood friends. Let's talk a little bit about the house itself. Okay. Well, the house and the estate are actually characters. The house is old and moldy. There's a prevalent sense of gloom and decay, and and the very elements seem to add to it. Right? It's not a place you would normally vacation, the kind of place you would expect to see from a Scooby-Doo rerun. There's swamp gas. It refers to it as miasma, which is essentially bad air emanating from the tarn itself. And there's a crack, as previously mentioned. The house is very old. It's so old, in fact, that it has a family crypt in the basement. Okay. Time was, that's where you buried your relatives. You see a nod to this, and this is also a set piece in the Cask of Amontillado. Okay. So as the story progresses, of course, as we mentioned, the narrator's come to comfort his childhood friend, is shocked by Usher's appearance. And here, this is a still frame from one of the old Hammer films from the 60s, where Vincent Price is playing Roderick Usher. He was a very famous horror actor from the 60s. If you remember the old Michael Jackson song Thriller, he does the voice narration at the end there. Usher suffers from a serious nervous condition. His sister has been sick with a wasting disease, which may reflect the decline of the house itself. She and her family were musically inclined, and she suffers, of course, as we mentioned, from catalepsies, which is a condition where the victim appears dead, but may simply be in a coma, which kind of factors into a series of deep body horrors for the human being. There's this sort of fear of tight spaces. There's a claustrophobic nature to it. And in many respects, because Usher and Madeline are kind of trapped in the house is kind of tomb-like in its own way. And so there's this prevailing sense of claustrophobia. When Madeline succumbs to her condition, Usher and the narrator carry her down to the tomb beneath the house. There we go. Now, when Madeline succumbs to her condition, they carry her down to the tomb beneath the house, where she will lie in state for 2 weeks. They could scarcely look at her because she looks so alive, and with lividity in her face and her chest, and her thin smile on her face. This is out of Usher's fear that doctors will come and steal her body. That's why they moved her to the crypt. They were afraid that they would steal her body for medical research, and this was something that was, in the early days of medical science, was not beyond scope of possibility. Usher becomes more hysterical after she dies. He's seen ghosts in the mist, which, of course, our fair-minded and logical narrator dismisses as simply swamp gas. A lot of things get blamed for swamp gas, or get referred to as swamp gas. Now, in the climax, the narrator is reading a heroic tale on the medieval tradition. When the action of the story begins to reflect what's happening in the house. There's pounding on the door in the book he's reading. There's also a pounding on the doorway coming from somewhere in the house. Usher is certain that he has buried his sister too early, and she returns as the doors of the chamber burst open and she collapses into his arms. The narrator, of course, flees the house, and turning back, he sees the crack in the building begin to widen. When the death of the twins, with the death of the twins, the house dies too. It collapses into the tarn. The family of Usher becomes irredeemably linked to the house, so much so that when they die, the house dies too. Terrifying and creepy tale. It draws a lot on the Gothic, this sense of foreboding and darkness, and the old house with the old family here. Madness, of course, being one of those things that was well, a very, very common terror. It was thought to be hereditary. And so if you had madness in your family, you would probably either not disclose it or lock your crazy relatives up in the attic so as to protect your prospects. If you had madness in the family, you were less likely to find a suitable mate for fear that the children would be insane too. So there is on YouTube a short video, short film of the short story. It's pretty well done. I think it was the one I saw on public television years back. I've added that to our course shell. So this was The Fall of the House of Usher. Hope you enjoyed the story, especially as we're heading into October. This is a great one for those classes that meet in the fall and kind of gets us in the mood for the holidays. So that's it for now, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.